So I'm Geoff Cutmore. I work for CNBC. I've just come off 2.5 hours of programming this morning, so I'm pepped up and ready to go. And I hope you guys are as well. While our panellists are sitting down, let me just share a quick anecdote with you. CNBC has an outreach program to schools that are local to us in London, and quite often we have interns that come in or people that just come in for work experience. We had a young lad come in. He said, very interested in television, think I have an opportunity in television. What do you think? And I said, well, I don't know. Come and have a sit in the control room. That's where you see all the broadcasts go out. Come and have a sit down. I do a 3-hour program, first thing in the morning from 6 till 9. I'll do the first hour and then we'll have a chat. So he came in, he sat down, young lad, you know, Gen Z, very kind of just starting to stumble into the light and see how the world looks, coming from a public school background. When I say public school, I mean it in the old sense, not the British sense. But you know what I mean. And so I did the first hour of programming, all went swimmingly, went into the control room, wandered over to him, said, so what do you reckon? He said, well, I'm a bit new to this, but I think I can take the second hour. And I said, well, I love your ambition. It's not quite how it works, but it is great to know that there are still young people who are very enthusiastic about the opportunity, want to seize it, and as much as we sometimes complain, it is clear that there is a generation coming up who are very ambitious, very eager, and they just need the right skills and training to fill the jobs available and to start businesses and to develop their careers. But what a strange time we've gone through. Pamela just shared a word with me that I've never heard before, so thank you very much for that. But it's a labour market term now, resenteeism. Resenteeism. People that resent coming back into the workplace after working from home, or quite frankly, they just feel they've lost purpose. So I hope you don't feel any resenteeism about being here this morning, particularly after what you've heard on the panel, because I think you're going to really enjoy this. But let me just share some other terms with you, which I think are extraordinary as well. Labour hoarding, quiet quitting, you may have heard that one. The Great Resignation, career cushioning. All of these phrases have emerged in the post-pandemic labour market. All terms now that we hear a lot of in, say, developed economies. And we've got this extraordinary situation where millions of Americans have just quit their jobs. I can get another one. It's not a problem. This one doesn't fulfill my life purposes. Priorities have changed and there are opportunities available. So why not? But we know that's not true everywhere in the world. For low and middle-income countries, the scarring has been extreme. And the ILO's own data on this is very clear. Job shortages mean 40 million full-time job work hours have now been lost in terms of those low and middle-income countries. So we've got tight labour markets in the West, and we have got a lack of jobs in low and middle-income countries at the moment. So the global world of work has significantly changed, and we haven't even started about, you know, reskilling or the re-education that we need, or the new education programs, or the new energy transition jobs, or where the new trends are going to take us. So we've got a lot to cover, so I'll stop talking at this point and I'll introduce our panellists, because I think you will recognise them all, I'm sure, but this is the way panels work. So I will just do this very quickly. José María Álvarez-Pallete is the Chairman and Chief Executive of Telefonica, and hopefully is going to tell us a lot about what Telefonica is doing in terms of reskilling. Pamela Coke-Hamilton, who shared that wonderful anecdote on resenteeism, although I'm sure there's none of it in the ITC. None of it, is the Executive Director of the International Trade Centre. Gilbert Fossoun Houngbo is the Director General of the ILO, whose website I scoured scrupulously ahead of this because it's full of very interesting information about how the nature of work is changing. And I'm very pleased to have Secretary Martin Walsh with us, the Secretary for Labour from the United States. And I think you are the highest representative here from the US government.
I think so. I'm not sure, maybe, yeah.
OK, so let's see if we can make some headlines and change some policy.
Thank you.
While we're here. But since I took so much from the ILO, I feel I need to give some back at this point. So, Gilbert, are we ever going back to the pre-pandemic labour trends? And should we? And how do we embrace the change and make it positive?
First of all, thank you for coming this morning. I know we are very short of time. On one hand, I want to believe that yes, we will go back to pre-pandemic in terms of getting back the hour worked that have been lost during the crisis. On the other hand, I don't think that we will ever go back in terms of the way we organize the industrial relation, the way we organize our work-life balance, and so forth. And you did mention a point that I believe is very critical that we keep in mind. While globally, and particularly in the global north, we know that we are picking up and we have shortage of labor. At the macro global level, the situation is not that rosy. Not only we see that gap between the low income and the emerging economy on one hand, where they are still struggling to recover from COVID-19. And at the beginning of 2022, that recovery was also going well for low-income country and emerging economy. But the impact of the multiple crises, starting with the war in Ukraine, and later on the inflation and all that we are going on, has just wiped out all those initial recovery from the low-income country and the emerging economy. Another thing that is interesting, our data showing, yes, you're right, if you compare third quarter 2022 to last quarter 2019, we still are short of 1.5% of working hours that we have lost, which is equivalent of 40 million jobs. Our projection for 2023 is a global increase, a global growth of employment by 1%, which is quite very low. And interesting enough, you also have the combining effect in Africa and the Middle East. We could pick up to 3% in terms of employment growth. However, when you take into account the population growth and the youth bulge, and therefore the net effect remain in that 1 or even below 1%. Critical point, and yesterday there have been some session on reskillings. What we're also noticing is the big gap between the low-skilled jobs and the high-end skilled job, which is also quite very crucial. We also have to keep in mind that we have 2 billion, and that's still in the informal sector. And between 2005, 2004, 2019, globally, the informal economy has gone down by 5%, which means that we have started formalizing that informal sector. But since COVID, the recovery that we're talking about, particularly again from the emerging economy, that recovery is happening more on the informal sector. So, which raised the issue of the risk that those low-paid jobs or low-skill jobs are facing in this informal sector with lack of basic social protection and so forth. Maybe one last point I don't want to monopolize too much of the time is, which is a very worry for ILO, while we project that the unemployment will raise up by 3 million from 205 million to 208 million total unemployed people in next year globally, we know that you'll have countries, basically mostly in the north, where we'll have where the labor market could heat up. And because the shortage that we are which raised for us the issue of the mobility of the workforce from one country to another or from one region to another. Finally, is what we call, by lack of better term, the working pools. In 2023, we estimate that 214 million workers with a regular 40 hours work a week will still be unable to have $1.90 a day on that. So while they are working full-time, they still will be struggling to pay their basic needs. The silver lining is, and I will stop there. The silver lining, of course, and I hope we'll touch on that, in the whole digital economy and the service-oriented economy that we know is going to pick up, giving opportunity to the youth.
Thank you very much for that. Secretary Walsh, let's come to you here, because the situation in America, it seems, is very different. You've got a very tight labour market. You've got millions of Americans who feel comfortable about walking away from their jobs at the moment. And yet you've got a government that's just about to inject $360 billion into the economy, in part to speed along the green transition, creating a lot of new jobs, careers, opportunities. One, is there a problem with the nature of work in America that so many people feel they've lost purpose or dissatisfaction, or they have dissatisfaction with the level of compensation? And how do you fix that? And two, where on earth are you going to get all these workers from for the new green transition jobs?
No, thank you. Thank you, and thank everyone for being here this morning as well. I think that just to kind of piggyback on the previous question, just part of it, the workplace is going to be very different, and I don't think it's going back to what it was pre-pandemic. Whether the work site, the idea of work, and how we move forward here. You know, I spent time as mayor of Boston for 7 years. I did a lot of recruiting companies into the city of Boston. Worked with colleges, universities, you know, built on our workforce development programs to create pathways into tech jobs that for people that didn't have necessary college degrees, and understanding that equity needs to be at the front and center of this. Become the Secretary of Labor, 10.5 million people out of work, getting people back to work. So to answer your question, I think there's a couple things. Right now in America, the unemployment rate is 3.5%. The labor participation rate is roughly 62, 63%. It's not quite where we need it to be. We need to get that number up. And we also need to, we have lots of folks in America that working in mediocre jobs, meaning they're paid mediocre and they feel mediocre pay. They're not quite in the middle class. They want to get in the middle class. So the future is this. I think there are a couple things. Number one is we're doubling down on apprenticeships. We're doubling down on workforce development, job training. We need to make sure the systems that are in place are actually going out and recruiting people into industry in America, new industries, making sure, or even existing industries, making sure that we're working with governors and mayors and local governments. We have to do that. And at the end of the day, when you go through a job training program, there needs to be a job there. That's why we're looking more at the apprentice model. When I leave here today, I'm going to Austria to meet with some companies to talk about the apprentice program in Austria. I know that here in Switzerland there's apprentice programs. They're set up differently than what we have in the United States of America. In America, we think of apprenticeships as the building trades, you know, and I come out of the building trades, and it's a great pathway. So we're going to really looking at apprenticeships. We're working with large corporations in America to think about, you need to think about apprenticeships. So I think that that's a way in. That creates an opportunity for people that might be in a low-skill, low-wage job today that have an opportunity to get into one of these green jobs that should be paying well. You know, so there is that opportunity. There are people out there, as we said backstage, there are people out there, we just don't know where they are. And I can't quite, you know, I don't have the fancy lingo to say, well, this is why they're not coming back to work, you know, because they still have a trust fund. These folks don't have trust funds. And I think a lot of these folks, you mentioned, I'm taking words out of your mouth now, some millennials might not be coming back to work, but we do have to, I think that what President Biden is focused on, creating an economy that works the middle class, the bottom up and the middle class out, really, we have to do a better job. And when I say we, myself, the administration, elected officials, of letting people know what that really means. Because I think people see, the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS bill, they hear all that, but they really have no idea what that is. And they don't equate that's actually a job. And we have to make that connection there. So I think that's one of the things we have to do. And then also America has, this is your headline, America has to really, we need immigration reform in America. America has been a country that's always depended on immigrants. Right now we don't have a good immigration policy. And I'm not talking about the southern border down by Texas. I'm talking about immigration policy. I'm talking about students that come from countries around the globe and go to America to get educated, to my city and other cities. And if they're not fortunate enough to get a visa, they get sent back. So we really need to look at immigration reform. And unfortunately, in a lot of countries in the world, immigration has become one of those hot button issues, and it really shouldn't be.
Is that going to happen now that you've lost the House?
I don't know. There was a lot of. I think that a lot of businesses, every business I talk to in America, big business, when I bring up immigration, they're all for it. And I said, you need to start this conversation. You need to have these conversations because, I think that the threat to the American economy, long term, is not inflation. It's immigration. It's not having enough workers, as you said. I mean, all these jobs are being created. And forget the jobs being created. There are jobs available right now in the United States of America that we don't have enough people for. So it really is about reskilling. I'm going to talk about we talked about the reskilling revolution yesterday. Doing that in America, upskilling and reskilling is something that's really key in America, but around the globe as well.
Pamela, the situation that you're working with, I think, is very different. And as I mentioned in the introduction, there has been long-term scarring, it seems, in low-income countries, particularly as we see value chains reshaped here. How do those jobs get brought back? Does this have to be external support, or is there something that can be done domestically in terms of self-help to generate that employment and that opportunity?
Thanks, Amar. I think that there are a couple of things that can be done. The first is, for example, I was just in the breakfast this morning on the African Continental Free Trade Area, and the potential that lies within that free trade area for increased jobs, increased development, increased economic prosperity, the whole shebang. What is going to be important to support that is specifically what the Secretary General of ILO, as well as Marty, Secretary of Labor, talked about. It is making the kinds of investments in new technologies, in digital upskilling, in sustainable green growth. Because what we've found is that, one, the green growth issue is great. Everybody's all for it. But it's a double-edged sword. It's a double-edged sword because while we are building a whole new generation of vehicles, electric vehicles and so on, we're pulling it from a continent and a country that is in serious trouble in terms of $1.90, if that much, per day for work. We're looking at DRC, 70% of the cobalt comes from one country, and we look at the situation there and we ask, well, how does this balance? So how do we re-establish a kind of, or I shouldn't say re-establish, how do we actually establish equity in this green transition? How do we ensure that those countries, those developing countries, are not left behind or put in a worse position? Secondly, there's a due diligence legislation that's coming out of Europe. That's talking about, making sure that along the value chain, they can account for their decarbonization efforts, their certification. Who's going to do that? How? These are critical issues because already we've seen in 2020, over 4,000 farmers were decertified from exporting cocoa from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. Over 4,000. And that's just the beginning. So there has to be a way also to ensure that that green growth, that green transition, does not make it worse post-pandemic for these countries. The other issue is the digital divide. The digital divide, digitalization has changed completely how the working world looks. And we've seen that in the pandemic. In 2 years, we've leaped 10. So while that has been great, and it's allowed for, e-commerce to thrive, and it's allowed for people to work from home, and there are 35% of the developing world connected. 35%. And in Africa, it's 18%. So if we're going to talk about a digital world and digital explosion, we also have to ensure that the connectivity is actually there. Because we can't talk about a digital growth and digital explosion if there's no connectivity. So that's another area that's going to be critical in terms of investment. On the issue of servicification, Marty, you talked about that. The fact that services is now basically thriving and moving more than manufacturing. Servicification of the jobs is also going to change in terms of immigration. And how does immigration work in tandem with the servicification of those jobs? How do we move forward on that? I think these are the kinds of elements that are going to be important. There's more what we call onshoring, reshoring, nearshoring, friendshoring, you know, the various new names that come about post-pandemic. But the point is that more and more countries are beginning to look closer in. And how is that going to affect jobs? How is that going to affect workers? And how is that going to enable these workers to become part of shorter value chains that are closer to them? So I'll stop there, but I think these are the clear elements that need to be looked at: the digital, the green growth, sustainability issues, and also inclusivity. Women have been affected the most, as we know, by this. Over 2 million women were removed from the workplace, literally, in the United States alone because of the pandemic. Whether they've been reabsorbed is another issue. How they've been reabsorbed is another issue. So the issue of the digital and the green transition also needs to apply to how do you help them reintegrate into what is going to be a very different and new economy.
Is it? I mean, we've got a business and a policymaker audience here, so we're talking directly to the decision makers ultimately.
Oh, good.
So, I mean, is this as simple as saying, underlying it all, take your trade to those countries, go looking for opportunities to do business with those countries?
Yes.
Because all of those things will improve the problems that you're describing.
Absolutely.
So trade is the answer,
well,
or just one of the answers?
Let me give you a little nuance. It's like this. There are many issues that, you know, we can't solve the whole world's problems. But there was a question about whether, you know, the green transition was going to kind of be the, you know, is it one of the more important things? I think it's the most important. The climate change issue literally is existential. So it's kind of like if you don't address the green transition issue or the climate change issue, it's like you're rearranging, you know, chairs on the deck of the Titanic, yeah? It's sinking. And while we're doing everything else to work around it and to do jobs, etc., the ship is sinking. So sustainability has to be tied in with economic growth. How do you also enable, for example, Africa is expected in the next few years to reach a population of 2 billion, youngest continental population ever, and 22 billion in exports per year if the African Continental Free Trade Area works. These are ripe, live opportunities. And there is nothing more, I'd say, energetic than a young person on a mobile phone. Just put them on it, and you'll see how quickly they are able to upload apps. We're working with a project in Kenya, in Dadaab, one of the refugee areas, and we've been able to work with companies to get them to put things on Amazon, on Etsy, to actually work their way out of refugee status and provide services online through this process. So there are opportunities and there is energy.
Jose, let me come to you here, because I know you lead a reskilling for employment initiative already in your own business here in Europe. So can you just help us understand what that does, how it achieves the goals that are set out for it, and how do you get sort of government or official buy-in to something you're engaging in to get that sort of public-private momentum that often helps with a broader program?
Sure. Thanks for inviting us here. Let me try to approach the situation from a different angle. We are living a change of era. Technology is really impacting everything. We are very focused on black swans like the pandemic or the war in Ukraine or inflation. But the reality is that what we see that it's flowing through our networks is a massive transformational change. I mean, 40% of the traffic that flows through our network today is not human anymore. Those are machines talking to each other. During the pandemic, video conferencing from a Friday to next Monday was multiplied by a factor of 7 times. So things that were supposed to happen 5 years from now happen in the middle of the pandemic. Every week of pandemic was equivalent to a year of digital adoption. So that means that it's changing everything. And technology is already here. And we are going to have as much technology as we want. So this is not about technology. Technology is creating inequality. The major challenge that we are facing as a society, in my opinion, is inequality. Yep. Because this wave of technology is going to destroy millions of jobs. It's going to create millions of jobs. But if we don't handle that transition in the right manner, we'll be dealing with social unrest. Mm-hmm. And social unrest is the most dangerous thing that a society can have. And this is not just in developing countries, it's in everywhere. So my point is that we need to make sure that whoever has a job is going to be able to keep that job. Whoever doesn't have a job needs to be able to find one, and we need to manage this transition. The traditional education system is not going to be able to cope with that effort because it's based on, techniques that are not able to cope with the amount of pressure that the system is going to have. So we need new ways of doing, and the public-private partnership is an ideal one. In our case, in the case of Telefonica, we used to be a traditional telecom sector. When you deploy fiber and 5G, what you run is no longer a telecommunication network. You run a massively decentralized supercomputer. The skills that were needed to do one thing are different than the skills that you need to do the other thing. So in our case, we have the largest reskilling program in Europe. We are reskilling, as we speak, more than 16,000 people using technology. And what we are proposing is to apply these new technologies to cope with the big problem, the societal problem. So I think that public-private partnership is essential. At the level of Europe, there is 10 million people unemployed, and there is 5 million jobs that are vacant because people don't have the skills. In the next 5 years in Europe, 20 million new jobs are going to be created in digital transition, but also in artificial intelligence or in the climate transition. So for me, technology is at the root cause of the problem, but it's at the root cause of the solution as well. So public and private partnership are essential. I think that at the level of Europe, we have a program called Reskilling for Europe that we are running at the level of the Association of Business Leaders in Europe, and we aim to create 1 million jobs in the next 2 years and 5 million jobs reskilling program in the next 6 years. So it can be done, but this is not because of the pandemic, this is not because of the war in Ukraine, this is not because of inflation. This is because there is a massive impact of technological change that is going to be here for good. And technology in itself doesn't have values. It depends on what we do, how we use technology, and which values we want that technology to be framework in. And I think that inequality is the problem and the one that we should tackle, and reskilling and technology is part of the solution.
Mark Benioff was here, I think, at a WEF or two back and said capitalism's dead, which I think, he always likes to say something fairly outrageous. But in essence, there is something going on here that is giving governments more control and the ability to spend more and take on more responsibility. And Labour in a number of countries is responding by reunionising, or union activity is increasing. I mean, I've just come from a country where you have to plan your travel very carefully because half the time the trains are not running, or you can't put your kids in school because the teachers are on strike. But it is clear that there is a rise in industrial strife, and it comes back to your question about inequality. Should we broadly welcome the re-engagement of governments in the labour market and the increase in union activity, Secretary Walsh?
Yeah, let me just the reason why the trains don't run or the teachers aren't in school isn't because the unions decided one day to wake up and go on strike. It's because they're fighting against inequality as well. And they're fighting for better contracts. I think that we have to understand that that's something that's really important here with labor unions. I mean, they fight for collective bargaining. And I know I'm in a room full of mostly business people here, and we had this conversation yesterday. I think the dialogue between business and labor needs to be broadened, and I think it has to be serious. And I think that there has to be more conversations about what labor unions are advocating for and fighting for, and what companies are looking at and fighting for, and not have the CEO not have a conversation with the president of the union, and then have, you know, the human resource director. This happened yesterday. One of the companies was talking, human resource director talking to the union. Well, it should be president to CEO just to understand what's going on moving forward. So I think that I just wanted to throw that in there. You know, I'm listening to the conversation. I've been here for a few days now, and you know, when you go into different rooms, you leave feeling there's a lot of questions to be answered, and there's a lot of unease, and there's a lot of what's going on in the world. And I think that a couple things I will say: leadership is needed right now. And when I say leadership, I don't necessarily mean political leadership. I'm talking political leadership, business leadership, nonprofit leadership, union leadership. Like, we need leadership. Inequality is one of the biggest challenges. Wherever you go, whether it's in Africa or America or wherever, inequality in America and the African-American community in America is underemployed. Women can't go back to work because there's not adequate child care, there's not adequate paid family leave, there's not adequate benefits, there's not adequate. So I think that leadership is so needed right now. I think that inequality can be addressed finally. You know, I've been in public life for 25 years. We've talked about inequality and closing the achievement gap and closing the racial divide for 25 years, and it's gone on long before that, and we still haven't closed it. We had George Floyd get killed in America. There was somewhat of like a revolution in America. We're going to be different this time. Well, you know what? We're not. And I think that right now, you know, the pandemic was brutal. When I was the mayor, we shut it down, the city down. Never in my wildest imagination, I think, as mayor of Boston, I'd be shutting down my restaurants and my schools and my businesses, and I'd be putting a curfew that people have to be in the home by 9 o'clock at night, and I never thought of that. Coming out of that, the last 2.5 years, we've had a lot of feelings and emotion. Let's make sure, as we continue to move forward, we come back stronger. Let's tackle the issues in America, and let's tackle the issues in the world that we've talked about forever. And it's time for action. It's not time for talking. We know the problems. We know the challenges. We have a lot of ideas and solutions. Let's implement those solutions, and let's stop talking about it. I think that's what this moment in time needs. And I think it'll address a lot of the issues on the stage today.
I'm happy to pass this question down. Anybody who wants to speak on this, Gilbert?
Yeah, I mean, I can't help by jumping in here. And first of all, wholeheartedly agreeing with Secretary Walsh. What we are observing, not only the reunionization is going on, but they are not, the union are not just fighting for a better pay or like this. That dynamic is also changing. They are looking at it inequality or inequities. What are the difference? You know, the traditional problem, okay, how much is the CEO earn at the end of the month? How much is the lowest pay in our... We have seen some movement in countries where the company's employees are maybe some of the best pay at the national level, yet they were in the street because of what they believe is unequal repartition of the gains coming from the windfall profit that we've seen from the energy sector. The other side, those movements that we are seeing is also in a non-unionized world, and that you also see emerging. So the social dialogue that Secretary Walsh was referring to, for me, is really essential, because the same union, they also don't want their business to go out of business. Let's be also very, very clear. So, you know, when you take a step back, and I really appreciate when you're coming back to the just transition and the practical effects, essentially, if you want to be blunt, we just cannot look at the environment as on a silo basis. You cannot look at the economy as a silo. So when you take a step back, let's be frank with each other. In fact, we have three pillars: the economy, the environment, and the social. Mm-hmm. And together, we need to make sure that the three move side by side. That's what is missing. Yeah. That's what we are calling for some kind of a new social contract. We need together to see what are the parameters. When Secretary Walsh is giving the example of 25 years in that thing have not changed that much. And what you're talking about the US, you can just put that from the global world. Worst, it has, this is the gap is widening. This is, and starting with the technology gap. So at one point, we need to put all of us together. The policymaker, you say, the business community, the bilateral, all of us, to really put new way forward, the way we want to share our life.
Just before you come in, Pamela, I'm going to open this up for questions. So have a think, something you'd like to ask. We'll get a microphone to you. And if you stand up when I point to you, that would be great, because then they can film you and make sure that everybody out there gets to see who asked the question. Pamela, you wanted to come in?
I just wanted to say quickly, this comes back to one of my fundamental issues, is that inequality is systemic. And that's the root of the problem. That when something is built in as a system, you have to literally rip the system out. And a lot of people aren't willing to do that. And so the first decision we have to make is, are we willing to change and challenge the systemic inequality that's built into how the economy works? I think that's one thing. The second thing is, once we've decided that we want to do that we want to have this tripartite partnership, that we want to have this engagement, labor, policy, the CEO's business, then we also have to be intentional. Because it's nice to have talks, we're great at it. We can sign things and have wonderful sessions and we leave here Friday and everything is all good. But we have to be intentional about what are the mechanisms that need to be put in place to actually break down the inequality that exists and to put the resources in order to build back for those who are in a place where they shouldn't be. I think that's the only way that we're going to be able to do it. And those have to be specific, they have to be measurable, they have to be timelined.
Let's have some questions. So I saw your hand go up first. Let's get a microphone to you. And yeah, if you could stand and then the cameras can find you.
I'm Stu Eisenstadt. I was President Carter's Chief Domestic Advisor and Ambassador to the EU in the Clinton administration, and I want to address this to Secretary Walsh and Mr. Álvarez. One of the things I took away from my time in Europe, and I'm so glad you're going to Austria, in the United States, those young people who are not college-bound are forgotten. And we talk about inequality and mediocre jobs. It's because we spend all of our educational resources on getting kids to college. Those who are not on college track, we spend nothing. So the apprenticeship program works in Germany, it works in Austria, it works in Switzerland. It gives kids training and jobs. They get temporary jobs on the training, and they get permanent jobs oftentimes afterward. It's a wonderful way of building. And so this is a serious effort. And in Germany, companies pay most of the costs, not the government. So I'm very pleased that you're doing this. Mr. Álvarez, I don't know whether in Spain, your company participates in an apprenticeship program, but it is a terrific way of dealing with the inequality issue and not forgetting all the non-college-bound young people who are otherwise consigned to very mediocre jobs.
Thank you for the question. Yep, Secretary.
Yeah, thank you. That's exactly what I agree with you 100%. When we have to put our young people on a pathway to college or a pathway to a career. And we can't do both. And for the last 25, 30 years, we've focused a lot on college in the United States of America. And I think that that is, in some ways, impacting us today with lack of workers and lack of skill in some ways. So I think that the reason, and I'm glad you brought up that in Germany, the companies pay for apprenticeship. Companies need to pay for apprenticeship because that's where the loyalty to the company comes. And I don't think it should be, I think government should have an investment in it, there's no question about it, and set up the systems and the plans. You know, we have to in America, and more than just America, the idea of what happens in Germany, in Europe, is really amazing. I have cousins in Ireland and cousins in England, and a lot of them went into apprenticeships. And they came out of school, they didn't go to college, they went to work, and they're in careers today. Their same cousins in America had to go to college, or they didn't go into career. So we have to do more of that. I agree with that. Thank you,
Jose.
Yes, for sure. I think that apprenticeships is essential, but I think that there is another angle. We tend to approach this situation with the traditional mind of the traditional educational system. I'm going to give you another example. We brought to Spain a thing called School 42. In School 42, you don't have teachers, you don't have classrooms, you don't have an official title at all. You learn to code by learning through your colleagues, and you don't have any recognized title at the end. And yet there is no unemployment out of 42. The first wave of 42 places that we issued, that we published, was 300 places, 17,000 people applied. And it's a non-official title. I mean, so my point is that applying technology to the way you learn, you can solve most of those things. I mean, it's not just apprenticeship, it's applying technology to skills. Because we will need to handle the transition between the impact of technology and the outcome of technology. If we don't handle that transition in a socially responsible manner, we'll have social unrest and a massive flow of populism. We are living the lowest percentage of liberal democracies on earth. Below 30% of the global population lives on a liberal democracy. So we need to channel that unrest. And I think that applying technology to the education system is part of that. So for sure it's apprenticeship, but I'm talking about a massive reskilling. You need subsidies, but you need, above all, skills. I mean, this is not just programming skills. It's social science, it's tolerance to frustration. There is a lot of skills that you need to teach people. And I don't think that the traditional learning system or teaching system is going to be able to cope with that.
Just to that point, I just want to follow up here because the point about who pays for this, I think, is fascinating. And the fact that it's a system in Germany where largely the money comes, that would normally have gone to shareholders, actually goes into that program. Does that approach work in your opinion? And should it be embraced in a more meaningful way in other countries? And can it be achieved in countries like the United States, where largely companies like to not have too much government interference?
I think the answer is yes. I mean, this is a global problem. It's not just a public problem. It's also a private problem. So in my opinion, reinvesting part of the funds of the company in addressing the problem, it's a good use of our funds. And through our foundation, we are doing 42, and we are participating in this Reskilling for Europe program. But I think that in our own business, daily business, we are reskilling 16,000 people because we know that we will need different skills 3 years from now, and the best people to fill those gaps is our own people. But we need to make sure that they are able to manage the transition. They need to diagnose themselves. So what are the skills gap that they have? We need to provide the tools for them to fill those gaps, and then we need them to apply for the new jobs. If we don't do that, we will be firing huge amount of people and hiring huge amount of people. Yeah. This is totally inefficient.
Okay. I saw a lady's hand go up here. Do you still want the question? Yep. Well, let's get a microphone to you. Come on.
Hi, good morning. I'm Brooke Hadid. I'm a member of the Global Shapers community representing the Port of Spain hub in Trinidad and Tobago. Mr. Cutmore, to your earlier anecdotes, I'm one of those younger millennials that actually changed jobs during the pandemic. I now work in Washington, D.C. for Social Finance, which is a national nonprofit that does impact investing advisory. Our work has really expanded since the pandemic in workforce development, particularly the instruments such as career impact bonds, paid forward funds. And, to your point on how this is going to get financed, apprenticeships and employer-backed schemes are very important. But I also want to hear from the panel, how can other instruments such as outcomes-based loans and income share agreements that shift some of the onus from students to training providers, be expanded not just within the US and other developed countries, but to developing countries as well. And also mentioning circumventing the gaps in the traditional educational system. How can we increase the availability of high-quality training providers, again, not just in places like the US, but in developing countries as well, where there's going to be a huge gap in terms of educational levels of attainment, not just at the student level, but at the teacher level as well.
Okay, great question. Pamela, can I start with you on that?
Sure. Well, let me start with and I'm glad to hear a Trini accent. Let me start with the issue of, you know, the reskilling and how is it we're going to, for example, work with companies to see retraining and investing in people or in students as a plus for them. Because at the end of the day, businesses are about money. We know this, right? I mean, it would be nice if everybody just loved everybody and, you know, we all hugged and got along. But the point is, we know that it's about money. But I think if they also understand that investing in, building in new methods of education. I remember, I'll give you an anecdote. I know it's late, but I grew up in a little town in Jamaica called Mandeville. And Mandeville, small, didn't really have anything going on until we discovered bauxite, 1950s. The entire town and education system built into Mandeville. They built the high school's technology lab. And this is in the 1970s. But they saw what that was going to, and it transformed everything about how our town worked, about the education system and the readiness for future work, about the kind of skills that they needed for the bauxite company. They started out bringing in all the labor from the United States because it didn't exist. By the time I left there, all the employees, managers were Jamaican. And so it's important, I think, for them to begin to see that it's not doing anybody a favor. It's actually building in for the future of their own work, of their own companies, and what the next need is going to be. So I'll stop.
Briefly, Gilbert, the cost of education, I think, was a key issue. And is there a way in which the ILO believes that somehow the burden of paying for that should be shifted away from the student and taken up more either by governments or by private entities that are in the sectors that those degrees or qualifications are focused on?
I hope I'm not going to make cause problem, but what I'm going to say, education should be free, punto. Education should be free, punto. And, you know, back to what the CEO, Álvarez, was saying, and also you mentioned it. Right now, we're talking about the digital, but we keep forgetting that the connection is not there. Exactly. on that. So even before you talk about having access to a loan, you need to know if you have an access to a bank account. The students don't even have access to a bank account in a lot of countries, and to start with. And, you know, one time in my career, I was prime minister of my country for 4 years. And, you know, I was coming from the UN system, New York, you know, everything wrong, so we can criticize the New Yorkers, but, you know, we know everything wrong very well. You know, I arrived to my country, post-crisis circumstances. And to access primary school, you had to pay in local currency 1,000, it was equivalent of $2 a year, $2 a year. So we decided to really cancel that, to make it free. By canceling the $2 a year fees, the attendance grew up by 15%. Just particularly sending girls. 5 years later, when we canceled that, the secondary, you know, equivalent of grade 7, the secondary, we see another jump. And I think it is really an investment. And plus what most of you said, Secretary Walsh and others say that if you look at what the German and the Swiss are doing in Austria in terms of the apprenticeship to make sure that it's built into the cost of the business. I think the business in Europe are quite used to that, so it's not necessarily a major issue. I personally, and I have to be very, very careful, it's not a criticism on the US. I always believe that even in the US, all the youngsters should have free access to education. And that came up during the campaign a few years ago.
Yeah. I don't think we'll get a dispute from Secretary Walsh, but you are in a cleft stick at the moment because the loan forgiveness issue is generating a lot of heat.
I mean, President Biden heard about that, and you know, when I was the mayor of Boston, I brought in free community college for all students. So you know, that's where we're headed in America. We need to head that way in America in a lot of different ways, and I think that it's important to create a level playing field for all people. And I think our community college in America, I know you were looking for an answer around the country, and I know our time is up, but community college in America is a resource that is underutilized in America.
I know there are a lot more hands that went up, but I'm afraid I'm getting those looks from the WEF team at the back here. So I think we'll draw it to a close here. Thank you, everybody, for your very active participation in our conversation. But don't go away, because the Managing Director of the World Economic Forum, Saadia Zahidi, wants to say a few things about what WEF is involved in.
Okay, well, thank you. We are way out of time, so I'll keep this very brief. Thank you for a very rich conversation. I think 3 key takeaways. One, there are very different outcomes around the world, and we cannot talk about the labor market as if it's one and the same everywhere. Second, social has got to be equal to the focus on green and the focus on the economy. And third, there is a new geography of jobs, and therefore we do need to look differently at digital labor rights as well as immigration. To do some of that, there are 5 communities that you may wish to get involved with. The Edison Alliance is focused on digital access for all. How do we actually expand that access is everywhere? Second, the Market Creators Alliance, focused on taking what are commonplace technologies and actually applying them to agriculture, to health, to care, so that we go beyond the focus on only frontier technologies and actually ensure that some of the application of this tech can expand growth opportunities, can expand job opportunities. Third is the Reskilling Revolution Champions that Secretary Walsh mentioned. That is a group that is aiming to reskill and upskill 1 billion people by 2030. Yesterday, they announced that they have reached 350 million 3 years into their work. We need all of you to get involved. Fourth is the Jobs Consortium, focused on job-creating investments and putting in place better labor standards. And fifth is the Parity Alliance, so that equality is embedded into all of these changes. Thank you so much, Geoff. Thank you to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's thank our panel in the traditional way. Thank you. Thank you. Good. Cheers. Love it.